A little background. It was January of a year ago when Professor John Barrett, who is the Elizabeth S. Linnaeus Scholar from the Robert Jackson Center, and I went to Nuremberg, both of our first trips there. And we went to the Palace of Justice, and there we were greeted, unexpectedly I might add, by the chief judge of the Bavarian court. There was Klaus Kostner, who was one of the senior authorities on the Nuremberg trial. Dr. Safferling. There was a gentleman from the German-American House, Bill Sheldon. There was some press there, and it was we were treated very well, and didn't expect it. In fact, we were overwhelmed. And part of the welcoming committee was Dr. Safferling. And we took a tour of the Palace of Justice, and part of that tour, which to me was fun, and I don't know if you'd ever been in the elevator, which actually went from the dock down to where the prisoners went and out. It's kind of cool, because you see it on the film about the Nuremberg trial, and all of a sudden we were in it. And hopefully it had been used since that time, but I wasn't quite sure. But I think the highlight for me was after we'd taken the tour, we had all this talent at the Palace of Justice. On a moment's notice, and with my camcorder right here, I said, let's go into the judges' chambers and talk about Nuremberg and Jackson. And it was terrific, because they weren't ready. I mean, you weren't queued up to do it. Nobody had asked you to prepare for it, but Chris and Dr. Kostner and Judge Bearschmidt, we all had this wonderful sort of impromptu conversation about the Nuremberg trials, its impact on today, what it means in Germany. To me, that was really interesting, because you never think about what it really means from a German perspective. At least in America, we don't think that way. And this will be the part of his conversation Tuesday night. I don't think we've talked about that, but if you can, that'd be great. He's here. We got him for a while. So, that established a relationship, especially between Professor Barrett and Chris. And I think you've connected since then.
We have.
And we'll connect again here this week. So he's as John Barrett would say, an extremely competent, quote, fast-rising star in the German international criminal law world. And so we're thrilled to have him here. And I thought I'm going to really back off. Normally I get into this Q&A. I like to interview people, but this is a crowd of German language, history students. I'm going to ask Chris to maybe give a little perspective as to what he does for a living, and if he wants to say a little bit about the German perspective in a general way about German perspective of the Nuremberg trial, and then let you guys take it over. I really want you to intercourse here. And his biggest question, is it going to be in English or German? And I'll leave it to you to decide. But in the meantime, for introductory remarks, Chris, thanks for coming, first of all. He had a longer route than he expected, ending up last night in Amsterdam. We're not going to ask what he did there, but we welcome him. And so what are you currently doing? What's life like for you in your scholarship perspective?
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for this introduction, and thank you for this opportunity to meet you here, because he told me beforehand that I would meet students, but I didn't know what actually would expect, what I have to expect. And I found it most thrilling now to see you as American students who obviously study German. You all study German language, as far as I understand. Which is maybe a rarity in the United States. And you study history, so it's a good mixture. What can I say about myself? Well, first of all, if I'm a bit slow today, it's due to a very long trip, which lasted 48 hours or something like that. The flight from Amsterdam to Detroit was overbooked, and I was rebooked on a flight for the next day. So yeah, I spent the night in a lonely hotel room, which is not the usual thing to do in Amsterdam, I know. But as I had to be at the airport this morning at 6 o'clock, I thought I'd rather stay as close to the airport as possible. So that's what I did. And I had things to do, Greg, in particular to prepare for Tuesday. Anyway, I'm glad to be here now, and I'll tell you a little bit about my life. If I'm not waiting in Amsterdam airport for a flight to Detroit, or then to come here. I'm teaching criminal law, and in particular international criminal law, at the University of Erlangen Nuremberg. Although Nuremberg is one of the biggest cities in Germany, it's got about 500,000 inhabitants, which from German perspective is really a huge city. The university is not in Nuremberg, but in Erlangen. But now it's called University of Erlangen Nuremberg. It's the closest university to courtroom 600. So interesting enough, maybe one would expect that one would expect a decent scholarship on international criminal law and on the Nuremberg trials in this or at this university, but we don't see any of that. The only person who has done research in this regard is Klaus Kastner. Greg has already mentioned his name. He's only a part-time professor. He's the former president of the Regional Court of Nuremberg. And he's a part-time lecturer at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. But there's no genuine research on the Nuremberg trials at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. I studied to teach there about 4 years ago. And I had a great interest in international criminal law, but mostly from a modern perspective. The International Criminal Court, human rights issues involved into that question. This was sort of my part of research. And I actually came from the University of Munich, and then I was in Hanover for a couple of years. And then by accident I ended up in Erlangen, where as a matter of fact I also grew up, but this is a totally different story and had nothing to do with what I'm doing now. So then I ended up teaching criminal law in Erlangen. And then all of a sudden I realized the closeness to this courtroom in Nuremberg. And believe it or not, although I went to school in Erlangen, Nuremberg, I've never been to this courtroom before. But then it was sort of a natural thing to do. As I was teaching criminal law and international criminal law in particular, it was a natural thing to do to go and visit this courtroom. And ever since then, I have sort of I feel a close relationship to, and a very strong relationship to this particular place. And it's for me an immensely impressive atmosphere when you sit in this room, and it is with, I think, minor and neglectable modifications. It is the same room in which Hermann Göring was sentenced to death. It looks just the same as, you know, from the pictures you might have seen of the Nuremberg trials. So there's an immense sense of history, an immense sense of German history that is in this room, and it's always for me a little bit of a cold shower that goes down my neck when I'm in this room. And you see the place where actually Hermann Göring sat and received his judgment. And of course, as Greg has said, one can also do funny things like drive down the elevator and follow the aisle that will lead you to the prison, which is behind the courthouse. So I feel, ever since I started to work at this university, I feel a strong relationship to the history of international criminal law, which I haven't had before I came there. And for a German, it's always a bit of a mixed feeling that you have towards these trials. Because obviously Germans were sentenced to death, Germans were sentenced to long prison terms. So it's always a bit of a mixed feeling. And in particular, when you look at the German population in general, you will find many people who would say the Nuremberg trials is a piece of victor's justice. As we call it Siegerjustiz, which is even more, as a term, even more negatively connotated, as if you say Victor's justice. It's, after all, it's justice. Siegerjustiz. It's not Siegergerechtigkeit. It's Siegerjustiz, if you know what I mean. And you should, because you study German. So that there is this mixed feeling, because the general population has not received, or a lot of people have not received these trials very well. So there is still also a sense, or for me, a bit of a mission to come to terms with this, and to come to terms with this trial, and to see it in a different way. The way that I see it, I can tell you, is to phrase it in a very dramatic sense. In this courtroom, the German democracy was founded. This is the basis of what my understanding of democracy is. This is a clear no to use of force in international law. This is a clear sign of promoting and respecting human rights. This is a clear sign to establish the rule of law. Those are things that I see what democracy should be about. So this trial in this room in Nuremberg, that was in some way or other the beginning of the Federal Republic of Germany that I then grew up in. I've already spoken too long now as a monologuist here. Feel free to interrupt if you have any questions. Maybe I go into a totally wrong direction and you are not at all interested in what I'm saying. Yeah, go on.
The same courtroom at Nuremberg was also, if I remember correctly, used by the Nazis before and during the war, and the Allies consciously said, well, that's how we're going to use this courtroom. Is that correct?
The reason why the Allies, and in particular the US, chose Nuremberg are plentiful. There are many, many reasons. The courtroom was used by the Nazis. It was just the ordinary courtroom in which crimes were prosecuted. And by the way, it still is. It still is used as an ordinary courtroom. If you commit a murder in Nuremberg, you will be prosecuted in this room. You have to stand trial. Actually, in exactly the same spot where Hermann Göring sat. Maybe you should try and choose a different place if you want to. So, I think there would have been better places to do this, what you're sort of hinting at, to say that Nazi justice in this room is ended by an international trial. In Berlin, you'd have much better places where the Volksgerichtshof had his sessions, maybe even in Leipzig, where the former Reichsgericht had his sessions. Obviously, Leipzig was a bad idea because it was in the Soviet-occupied zones and the Americans would never have gone there. And Berlin was a different story altogether because it was sort of a mixture of all the four allies. So it was important for the Americans to have this trial held in the American zone. There was one reason, so this was one of the main conditions. It needed to be in the American zone. And there it was difficult, just the matter of infrastructure. It was difficult to find a courthouse that still existed. Because most of the German cities were bombed. It wasn't easy to find a palace of justice big enough to host this kind of venue. And it was sort of surprisingly enough that although the entire city of Nuremberg was totally bombed down, more or less the only building that was remaining was the courthouse. And it had a prison. This was another reason. The courthouse had a prison that was just behind it, and it was also big enough to host these 20 or so prisoners. So I think those were more the reasons. or the reasons that were prior to, that they were actually then also in the city where the Nazis had their party rallies, and that they were actually also in the city where the Nuremberg laws, these racial laws, were actually passed. That was another sort of strong sign, but that was only more or less by coincidence. I don't think they picked this because of the history of Nuremberg. They picked it because the infrastructure was there.
Where you say that in Erlangen that study is not very strong of Nuremberg, where in Germany is the most study of the Nuremberg trials conducted?
I don't know. I don't think there is a specific place. There are several people who do research in this area, but they are all over the place. I could say, in particular from the criminal law perspective, Professor Werle, he's in Berlin at the Humboldt University. Then you have Professor Rüping, who's at the University of Hanover. You have, from a political science point of view, Professor Perez, who is also at the University of Hanover. You have Professor Stolleis in Frankfurt. Those are the names that come to my mind right now that do research in this field. I think maybe even Erlangen, the reason why Erlangen, how do I put this? For a long time after the trials were held, German scientists, lawyers in particular, wouldn't look into this issue at all. And indeed, neither would historians or any other scholar. They just wouldn't. It was too hot an issue. It was politically a hot issue, and you'd rather not address it because probably you'd be too critical, and then, in particular, during the time when Germany was still occupied, maybe you'd have difficulties with the occupying powers, like, with the US occupying power. Probably be in trouble if you criticized the movement. This was at least the idea that was behind. And then again, obviously, there were a lot of professors who had a decent Nazi past, and who probably would act against their conviction if they'd research into the Nuremberg trials and not criticize them. And in particular, also at Erlangen University, you had Professor Franz-Jürgen Bruns, who was actually one of the forerunners of the Nazi ideology. And, in his PhD thesis, which was published in Breslau in 1938, I think, he wrote quite blatantly that Jews should not be perceived as human beings, but as things in the criminal law doctrine. So, those are the kind of people that, after the war, were teaching in Erlangen and at several other universities as well. So this is not a unique figure, as a matter of fact. University of Munich, you had Karl Lorenz and Mounts. Those were also people who were having an incredible impact on the Nazi ideology and how to support Nazi ideology through law. And they were just carried on after the war and gave lectures and educated young lawyers, and obviously nobody cared.
I'd like to ask about that. Because you said that in this room there was a Federal Republic of Germany was founded. But if these people that really were still working after these trials and after the war, what did really change with the Nuremberg trials?
I think a lot changed. Maybe, a lot changed. Maybe the change was only visible after a couple of generations had passed away. I don't know. There's no doubt about it. the decades that followed the end of the war, German society as a whole was feeling, as they say, they felt as an occupied country that had lost the war, and that was a sentiment of I'm struggling to express this in order not to harm anyone. They were just not ready to fully understand what had happened. They didn't want to. The German population in general just closed its eyes towards what happened. Lawyers, ordinary citizens, other scholars, judges, whoever you look at, they didn't want to understand what had happened. They didn't want to be remembered what they did and what their maybe forefathers did. And if you look at the writings and if you look at the judgments, you see a clear tendency towards exculpating. They wanted to, exculpate and free their forefathers or themselves from what they had done. So obviously the Nuremberg trials stood as a blatant sign against that, which pointed at guilty offenders, guilty people. So amongst you there are guilty persons. And it took a very long time, and maybe it even takes the generation of these people that are very close to this time to die out. I really think it needs that. There is still, if you look now, over the summer we had this conference in Nuremberg, right? We had a big conference where we were talking about the Nuremberg trials. In the preparation of this, I was in the preparatory committee of, we were 5 or 6 people, amongst them the president of the regional courts, the upper regional court in Nuremberg, the vice president, and so forth. And you couldn't imagine how much we struggled over individual formulations. Do we say Nazis in German language? Do we use the term Nazi, which is clearly a negative term, or do we say sort of in a more objective way, do we just say NS, if we say Nazi-Zeit or Nazi-Regime, oder sagen wir NS-Zeit, NS-Regime, which is more objective. And there are so many people who just don't want to use this term Nazis. Yeah, why not? Do you have a reason? It sounds bad. And NS sounds a bit better. Sounds not as bad. So you try, in the formulations to come up with euphemisms and to phrase it in nice sentences, just not in order not to sit down and say, those are incredible atrocities and those were Nazis. Let's face it. And so even now, if you want to publish something on this issue, you have to be very, very careful on how you phrase these things. There's so many stones that you could stumble over. It's incredible. You really wouldn't believe it. And I think that, so my generation, or our generation, is much more flexible in that regard. They're much more willing to say, oh yes, that was, let's name it. Let's say it the way it was. And they're not so willing to try to put it into euphemisms and nice phrases. So, and we are not at the end of the alley. Not at all. Not at all. If I look at publications, latest publications from this year by what I always thought liberal thinking criminal lawyers, you wouldn't believe how they deal with, for example, Nuremberg trials. Can you expand on that? Well, I was really shocked actually by there's a new commentary on the criminal code. You know, we have in Germany we have codified law, so we have a big criminal code, and there is a new publication explaining this code, a commentary, as we say, commentary on the criminal code. And the introduction to this commentary is written by Professor Hassemer, who is the Vice President of the Federal Constitutional Court. Is a very, very elaborate figure, and I always thought a very liberal-minded person. And I was very impressed by his writings all over, you know, his career. I always thought, yeah, he had sort of a right approach to criminal law. And now he wrote in the introduction on the problem of retroactive legislation. Do you know what that is? Have you heard the term ex post facto law? Nullum crimen sine lege, those are all synonyms. Retroactive criminality. He writes about this, saying that because Section 1 of our criminal code says that there is no retroactive criminal law allowed. And then he says that, how do I put this? So it was always doubtful. He writes something like, it was always doubtful. Oh yeah, now I remember. He writes on what the Nazis did. What the Nazis did is they abolished this principle. So they had retroactive criminality. But basically, in the Nazi time, it was a crime to violate the gesundes Volksempfinden. Have you heard this term? Gesundes Volksempfinden, the overall common sort of image of society. Gesundes Volksempfinden. If you violate this, whatever that is, it's basically Nazi ideology put into this, you know, behind this word. If you violate the gesundes Volksempfinden, you're guilty of a crime. And so this is also a blatant breach of this overall principle of the rule of law. So he says the Nazis abolished that. And then there comes, just in parentheses, this laconic sentence saying that, well, but the Allies afterwards didn't always comply to this principle either. This is all he says in this introductory chapter of about 50 pages on the Nuremberg trials. I think this is appalling. This is really appalling and not absolutely not up to date, because at least sort of the younger German scholarship is actually now, and even you could look, but I may explain, I might explain this on Tuesday, and if you look also at the German politics, there are strong signs to accept what happened at Nuremberg. Also from this point of view, from this retroactivity principle, where there is a good argument to say it was a violation of the retroactivity principle as regards the crime of aggressive war, the crime of aggression. There is a good argument. I don't say that I share this argument, but there is a good point. And but you can look, if you look at the writings of German scholars, youngest German scholars, and particularly also if you look at the government papers, you can see that there's a tendency to accept what happened at Nuremberg. So what Mr. Hassemer, Professor Hassemer, the Vice President of the Federal Constitutional Court, writes on this subject in this country, I think it's really appalling.
Are your political scientists and your historians also tending to fall into that, the way the legal community of the older legal communities taking it?
Well, the historical community, I'm not a historian, so I know more about law than about history and the other subjects that you were naming. But I think for a long time, these other social sciences left the problem to deal with the Nazi past up to the lawyers. Where I can't see the German historian that from early on was actually researching on what happened in Auschwitz. I think it needed the Auschwitz trial in 1963, and in particular this General Attorney Fritz Bauer, I don't know if you've come across that name. Fritz Bauer, he was General Attorney of the state of Hesse. He was actually a Jew who was survived the war in Scandinavia and came back after the war, and then he was made General Attorney. And he prosecuted the Auschwitz commanders and guards and a whole bunch of them. And this was actually in 1963 the first time with a high media attention where the German population was actually shown what really happened there. It was shown on television really for the first time, and the newspapers widely reported how many deaths and how it was actually done. You know, beforehand it was basically nobody cared, they looked away, and it wasn't made public. So it took the lawyers. I think the social sciences also failed completely in this regard. But with due respect, because I can't really judge, because I don't have the actual insights, but this is my impression.
One of the impressions and you may have talked about this, but one of the impressions I walked away from in talking to Dr. Talbrick and Bear Schmidt and Kostner was the fact that in Nuremberg there were really three phases which have the name attached to it that they're just they can't get rid of. The Nuremberg laws, the Nuremberg rally grounds, because you can't blow it up, it's there. And then the Nuremberg trials they had to come to grips with, because Nuremberg is a name attached to this international criminal trial. Yet it seems like what I walked away from all three of them at separate times saying, the Nuremberg trial to the Germans has become a cathartic event. An event where, in fact, we came to grips with that. The Nazi government came to grips with the Germans, came to grips with a lot of things, which ultimately permitted us to think in the forms of democracy. You see this sort of straight line from the Nuremberg trial to democracy, and then going backwards, the Nuremberg trial, they see a sort of a straight line to Jackson. Now, they may have been saying that just for us, but I was impressed, I must tell you. And is that kind of a general view, or is that just three guys happen to make us feel good?
Well, if you count me amongst them, it makes maybe four. But no, I was just criticized for this opinion, which I just explained here, which I share your view. This was the time when German democracy was born. But if you have a general poll in Germany, this wouldn't be the result. But polling is a different story altogether. And polling Germany, or polling Germans, has a new view to it after our general election. I realize that our pollsters aren't as good as maybe we thought they would be, or maybe the population isn't as good for the pollster.
Well, it surprised us in the United States because everything we read, you were going to have a female chancellor, no questions, done game.
Yeah, you should have asked me before. I would have told you exactly that this would be the outcome. Yeah, I was pretty sure that it would turn out that way. Maybe I was pretty sure. Anything new on that?
Has there been a coalition formed?
I'm pretty certain that it's going to be a coalition between the Labour Party, the SPD, and the Conservative Party, the CDU. Whoever's going to be the chancellor in this coalition, I can't tell you, but this is most probably going to be the coalition. And it's obviously what people wanted. I think this is a clear sign what people wanted. I think this is the general tendency, general sentiment that we should have this große Koalition, although everybody seems to hate it, but nobody knows why. amongst politicians, it's got a very, very bad reputation. But it seems that amongst the population, it doesn't have that. I was actually surprised that, a week after the general election, they made a re-poll and asked, would you vote the same way as you did last week? And everybody said yes. I was actually surprised because I would have thought, these swing voters would say, oh my goodness, now what, look at that result. And I'd rather vote than that to have clear sort of frontiers and clear boundaries. No, they're happy with the result. Mm-hmm. There you go. That was maybe a surprise, but...
What are the topics in your view related to the Nuremberg trials that are worth researching now that people ought to devote their energies to? What questions or unanswered questions are there?
There's been a lot of research has been done, and many of the problems I think are more of a political nature than of an actually academic or scholarly nature. What is still unsolved is this problem of retroactivity. There are two camps, and those are mostly, I'd say, political camps that say this was a violation, and the other side says no, it wasn't. And I think in this regard, still you could research more. What I also found interesting is, or very, very sad, it's also one of the critical points often mentioned by Germans, that the German victims were not an issue in Nuremberg trials. It was war crimes related, crimes that happened in Poland, in France, in Ukraine, wherever, but not the pre-war atrocities that the Nazis committed amongst its population, particularly also amongst the Jewish population. That wasn't an issue for several reasons. But for what reasons exactly? Jackson had a different view on that. As far as I understand, he wanted this to be made a topic, could have achieved this, but he'd been successful with introducing the crime of conspiracy, but he wasn't successful in that regard. So it was focused very much on the aggression, on war crimes and crimes against humanity, and the crimes against humanity being war-related.
Christy, if you talk about your research on the Russian role?
Okay.
Tell
The
us.
Russian role is something, do you research on that in that regard?
I'm just starting.
Okay, because this is something else. Everybody talks about, mostly is talked about the American engagement, and there's no doubt that Jackson's personality and his engagement there was just that was the trial. But nevertheless, there were 3 other nations involved, and we had now recently in Nuremberg we had this conference, and we had a very interesting panel conversation, and we had an American lawyer, a French lawyer, Soviet lawyer, and an English historian, together with a German lawyer, to discuss their roles of their national states. And that was very interesting because it became just so clear how different their approaches were. Every country had something else to be dealt with in this trial. And the Soviet role, unfortunately, wasn't sort of presented by a genuine Russian lawyer as I would have hoped, but by the Soviet-born Michael Basler. You might know him from several publications in this regard in international criminal law, and in particular also in the forced labor reparation issues. He published a lot on that. Michael Basler. Nevertheless, he was born in the Soviet Union, and he was one of the organizers of the conference, so he felt obliged, or he wanted to take his part. And yeah, you can say, I can tell definitely from this experience in that day, I was lucky enough to moderate this panel to understand that the Soviet role primarily is completely unresearched.
There you go.
And it's also difficult because over the, you know, from 46 to 1990, nobody could access their archives. So there's actually probably groundwork still missing. And even with the British and the French, I'm not so sure. I mean, the British have their maybe a bit snobistic attitude, saying that, oh, well, Jackson didn't do all that well, in particular when it comes to Goering, you know. They would also giggle at Jackson's performance. So, but that's their real courtroom professionals, these British barristers, and this may be their approach may be a bit snobbish. And the French were sort of, oops, you know, there's the French judge. What's he doing here? They jumped on the wagon on the last, or they were taken on board sort of in the last second. Why are you laughing? Are there French people around in this room? I didn't know that, no?
It's not quite clear to me what was their role. I mean, I know they had a part of the trial, but were they actively engaged? Was there a lot of data that they had which could be interchanged?
Yes, there was. In particular, the crimes that were committed in France, mm-hmm. and through the collaboration, partly the collaboration with the government, between the Nazis, German Nazis, and the government, there was a considerable amount of input, and also there was a strong urgency amongst French, I think, to sit at this judge's table because of what happened in France, and they had also a strong resistant movement and all that. You know, this is maybe one line that they needed to be seen and wanted to be seen as part of the victors and sit at this table and to render justice to what happened amongst their population. I think there was a strong urge felt in France. They had great problems though with the crime against humanity issue. They thought that this was actually a breach of the retroactivity principle. They were not so much bothered with the crime of aggression or the aggressive war bit due to the Calais-Briand Pact. You know, they thought that was fine, but the crimes against humanity, that was a difficult issue.
What's your next area of academic research and writing?
At the moment I'm doing something completely different. It's not completely different actually, but it's not, at face it's not related to the issue. I'm writing a book on the culpability principle. So basically, what is mens rea in your terminology? Mm-hmm. You know that every crime splits up in actus reus and mens rea, and then you've got defenses that you can sort of raise against an criminal act that you've committed. And I'm focusing on the mens rea and the subjective parts of the crime. So what do we need from the personality of the criminal in order to say that he's responsible? By what he knew, what we call intention, and also by his sentiments, maybe also by his diseases. Maybe he has some psychological mental disorders, these things. That's what I'm writing on. I'm comparing basically the English system and the German system in order to prepare something like a European criminal law, which is about to evolve. As everything in Europe is about to evolve.
Questions?
Can you address Germany and the International Criminal Court? Their position as it stands now, jurisprudence on that?
Yes, of course. I'm delighted to do that because there's something, this is almost something that I can be proud of, because I think that Germany plays a good role in this process. I think they are one of the protagonists. They are up in the fourth line and say, we need this court. We want this court, and we are sending our best people in order to support this court. And this is good news. This is good news because it legitimizes a little bit also ex post the Nuremberg trials. Now this engagement now shows a little bit, at least, that it couldn't have been that bad 50 years ago. It takes up this idea from 50 years ago and says, okay, let's do this now on a general basis, and not arbitrarily in this conflict and then in that conflict and maybe this one not. And no, we want this on a general basis and a permanent basis at an institution that we call International Criminal Court. It is also due to the personal activity of Hans-Peter Kaul, who was a diplomat in Foreign Office, German Foreign Office, and is actually now German judge at the International Criminal Court. And he symbolizes the idea of an International Criminal Court in Germany somehow. He's really the person who worked night and day ever since 1997, ever since this process started, in order to be successful at the conference in Rome and then in the preparation of the court. And now he's been elected judge and is president of the pre-trial chamber. So he's the one who's actually already handing down decisions on the Darfur area, regional cases that are already pending at the court. So Germany is very, very supportive. And as I said, this is good news.
I'm just curious with the ICC, no matter what countries sign on to it, even if the United States does eventually, from where do you think it will get its power to enforce decisions? That is, international law has a pretty abysmal record for enforcement, from the League of Nations to various UN resolutions. That is, it's fine to say you are in breach of such and such law, but then without some sort of apparatus to enforce it. I'm just kind of wary of the future of the organization.
An absolutely fair point that is. The difficulty, I think, will lie in the time before a trial can start. The difficulty will be to find a culprit. If you have the accused in The Hague, if you achieve that, and this can be a difficult issue of cooperation amongst states, and as you rightly pointed out, the states are not always willing to execute international orders, and this could be such a case where they have, in collaboration, to execute an order of the court, like an arrest warrant. And maybe they are reluctant to do that. This will be one of the very, very important points that we don't see how they work in the future. If they have the accused, and if he stands or she stands trial in The Hague, the rest of it won't be a problem, I'm pretty sure. This is the lessons that we learned from the Yugoslav and Rwanda tribunal. There's not a lack of prison places. A lot of countries offer to host international war criminals. Germany is amongst them, Scandinavian countries, even Iran has offered. I don't know if it's a good idea to get war criminals to go to Iran, at least not for them. Pretty sure they would probably not do this again if they survive. So, but no, I think that this will not be a problem. It hasn't proven as a problem at the Yugoslav tribunal, and the Yugoslav tribunal itself was also without So they were depending on cooperating states, and there are many that were willing to cooperate.
Questions in English, in German? Let's have one German question. 'Cause I wanted them to. Who can come up with a question in German? There we go.
Ja. Sie haben vorhin gesagt, dass, dass letztendlich in Nürnberg die 20 Leute angeklagt wurden. Und meine Frage ist, dass nicht für den Rest der deutschen Bevölkerung quasi die in dieser Angeklagten als Sündenböcke dargestellt wurden und sich dadurch der Rest der Bevölkerung, die vorher auch alle die NSDAP gewählt hatten, die sich dadurch nicht von aller Schuld freisprechen konnten. Nach dem Krieg gab es plötzlich in Deutschland keinen einzigen Nazi mehr. Und auch diese 4- oder 5-stufige Einteilung der Bevölkerung in Mitläufer, wie auch immer, Täter und Nicht-Täter, die hat letztendlich zu nichts geführt aufgrund des bürokratischen Aufwandes. Denken Sie, dass die Nürnberger Prozesse die Aufarbeitung der deutschen Geschichte auch behindert haben?
Du bist aber schon Deutscher. He cheated, he's German. Did you know that?
No.
Okay.
I had no clue, but answer in German.
Ja, es ist eine sehr, sehr gute Frage. Und die Entscheidung ist da gar nicht leicht zu treffen. Die Nürnberger Prozesse haben ja auf jeden Fall eines auch Gutes gezeigt. Eine Kollektivschuld gibt es nicht. Kollektivschuld ist der falsche Begriff, also jedenfalls im rechtlichen Sinne. Ja, Kollektivschuld gibt es nicht. Insofern war es gut, dass es eben die Nürnberger Prozesse gab, in denen individuelle Schuld festgelegt worden ist. Und genau das, was Jackson gesagt hat, dass Kriege nicht von Staaten und Institutionen geführt werden, sondern von Individuen. Genau das wurde gezeigt und das war gut. Es gab ja dann noch ein paar Nachfolgeprozesse, also es wurden ja nicht nur die 22 in diesem Nürnberger Hauptkriegsverbrecherprozess angeklagt, sondern ja auch noch eine ganze Reihe anderer, die man ja jetzt so kennt als Juristenprozess, Medizinerprozess, industriellen Prozesse. Wenn man sich diese Namen schon so vor Augen hält, merkt man schon, dass das eigentlich auch so immer ein Spektrum und einen Ausschnitt aus der Gesellschaft nimmt. Ja? Also hier die Juristen, hier die Mediziner, da die Industriellen, sodass da auch gerade durch diese plakative Benennung eigentlich klar sein sollte, dass nicht nur die paar, die dann da jeweils angeklagt waren, sondern ganze Bevölkerungsgruppen, ganze Berufsgruppen sich schuldig gemacht haben. Da wurden halt von den Amerikanern in der amerikanischen Besatzungszone ein paar jeweils herausgegriffen und denen der Prozess gemacht, die vermeintlich die schlimmsten waren. Die Gefahr dabei, dass der Rest Deutschlands sozusagen da sitzt und denkt, naja, jetzt sind die Schuldigen gefunden und ich bin frei von Schuld, die Gefahr ist natürlich groß und das ist natürlich auch so gelaufen. Gar keine Frage. Das sieht man vor allem an der Aufarbeitung in den Urteilen. Wenn man sich den weiteren Verlauf anschaut, die allermeisten Richter, teilweise in manchen Staaten wurden bis zu 100% der früheren Nazirichter weiter beschäftigt. Also müsste man ja denken, eine himmelschreiende Ungerechtigkeit. Wie gibt es denn das? Ja, wer sollte das machen? Die Jungs sind alle an der Front gefallen und man hatte halt nur noch die es vorher auch schon gemacht haben. Und da der radikale Schnitt nicht möglich war, einfach weil der Kalte Krieg schon so weit fortgeschritten war und hier mitten durch Deutschland plötzlich diese beiden Blöcke aufeinander trafen. Man brauchte ein starkes Westdeutschland. Wurde sozusagen, was soll man sagen, der Bock zum Gärtner gemacht oder man hat dann irgendwie halt das geringere Übel vermeintlich ausgewählt, also ich denke schon auch aus alliierter Sicht und gesagt, wir brauchen jetzt aber hier ein funktionierendes Rechtssystem, um Deutschland wieder aufzubauen, damit es als Bollwerk auch gegen den Osten fungiert. Ich denke, das war auch eine der Motivationen. Und in dieser Situation hatten diese Richter ja noch mal viel mehr die Möglichkeit, sich zu exkulpieren. Das haben sie durch die Bank gemacht. Also man kann ja hanebüchende Urteile sich anschauen, wenn man sich nur anschaut, diesen Tatbestand der Rechtsbeugung. Wurde so, also dass Richter, die während der Nazizeit willkürliche Urteile gefällt haben, dafür strafrechtlich zur Verantwortung gezogen werden können. Ja? Da gibt es einen extra Paragraphen, die Rechtsbeugung. Und dieser Paragraph wurde so extrem eng ausgelegt, dass kein einziger von diesen Richtern verurteilt worden ist. Ja, wie auch. Die Jungs saßen ja auf der Richterbank. Ja, das waren ja alles Kollegen. Natürlich haben sie das extrem eng ausgelegt. Und zwar sie haben mir jetzt geschickt, eine extreme subjektive Auslegung unterlegt, sodass, wenn man dass also Rechtsbeugung dann nicht vorliegt, wenn der urteilende Richter davon überzeugt war, dass er Recht spricht. Übersetzt, je größer das Nazischwein auf der Richterbank war, desto geringer die Chance, dass er sich wegen Rechtsbeugung strafbar macht. Da stehen dann die Haare zu Berge. So ist es gelaufen. Interessanterweise, ist ja toll, ich kann jetzt hier alles erzählen, ist am Dienstag nicht mehr da und ihr hört es dann am Dienstag auf Deutsch. Also I'm giving my talk that I'm giving on Tuesday.
So we'll be repetitive because I won't know.
You're not getting it firsthand on Tuesday. People already have.
Dass nach 1990, nach der Wiedervereinigung, die ganze Geschichte völlig anders gelaufen ist. Plötzlich war das alles kein Problem mehr. Wieso Rechtsbeugung so subjektiv interpretieren? Das wurde plötzlich völlig anders. Also da wurde es plötzlich geöffnet. Da wurden dann SED-Richter verurteilt dafür, dass die Kündigung ausgesprochen haben, weil der halt nicht parteihörig war oder sowas. Ja, da wurde das Kriterium plötzlich verschoben. Genauso wurde mit dem Verjährungsproblem umgegangen und auch mit dem Rückwirkungsverbot. Ja, dieses Retroaktivprinzip, was ich vorhin genannt habe, das wurde dann plötzlich auch völlig anders ausgelegt, diesen Mauerschützenprozessen. Gab es eben dann konnte man sich halt nicht auf die Rechtfertigungsnorm des Schießbefehls an der Mauer berufen. Das war halt dann abgeschnitten. Da ging es plötzlich. Also man sieht schon, es muss einfach daran gelegen haben, dass diese Richterschaft in den 50er Jahren so durchsetzt war von entweder wirklich alten Nazis, die sich selber nicht haben anklagen wollen oder entschuldigen wollten durch die Urteile, oder eben, und den Effekt darf man auch nicht unterschätzen, von deren Kinder, die auch in der Kriegs- und Nachkriegszeit aufgewachsen, damit einfach tagtäglich konfrontiert waren. Jetzt spreche ich über psychologische Prozesse, dass sich sowas überträgt, und zwar jetzt von Täterseite, aber auf Opferseite genau das Gleiche, aber vor allem jetzt hier auf der Täterseite, dass es überträgt und die Kinder leben was fort und wollen dann auch das Verlangen danach, ihren Vater vielleicht von Schuld im Nachhinein noch frei zu sprechen. Auch wenn es sicherlich zu Hause nie thematisiert worden ist. Bei mir zu Hause wurde nie drüber gesprochen. Ja, das hatte man immer vermieden. Und so auch kann ich mir gut vorstellen, dass in vielen Bereichen es so gelaufen ist, dass auch die Kinder noch versuchten, ihre Eltern zu rechtfertigen oder wenigstens zu entschuldigen über extrem milde Urteile, beziehungsweise einfach auch im soliden Wegschauen. Und so langsam habe ich den Eindruck, kommen wir an eine Grenze, wo sich doch ein Generationswechsel zeigt und Leute doch etwas genauer hinschauen und Fragen stellen, die sich vielleicht deren Eltern noch nicht haben trauen. Sicher, also wenn ich mich jetzt auch selber anschaue, ich bin in einer anderen Situation. Ich habe die Nachkriegszeit nicht erlebt. Ich habe das Leid nicht mitgekriegt. Ich bin 71 geboren, da ging es uns in Deutschland schon allen wunderbar. Und ich bin in einer ganz anderen Position, das jetzt mit diesem Abstand hier betrachten zu können und vielleicht dann auch mahnend den Finger erheben kann, zu sagen, da wollten sich aber welche freisprechen.
Aber gegen wen denn von den Finger heben? Sie sagen selbst, Leute sterben inzwischen. Die stellen ja da aus. Und ich möchte meiner Familie inzwischen keiner, den das betrifft.
Ja, darum geht es. Es geht gar nicht um persönliche Anschuldigungen, das meinte ich nicht. Ich meine den Finger erheben dahin, dass wir schauen, dass wir ein System entwickeln, dass sowas in Zukunft nicht mehr vorkommt.
Also,